Happy Mother's Day, everybody, including those of you who are not mothers. And although it's a boon to Hallmark, it's also a boon to all of us to find a moment, even if it's a collective commercial moment, to be grateful for having been born, really, and to recognize and honor that your birth was not easy for somebody, that coming into this world is not easy. I know it wasn't easy for you, but you don't remember. Mothers remember. And they know the story of your birth. And in many ways it informs their sense of who you are and how much they love you. Of course, I'm projecting happy, positive stories or outcomes of stories. I think there are mothers who resent their children for the pain that they caused. And I think there are millions of ways or billions of ways to view the process of coming into being. I was thinking this morning about stories. It just kind of flooded into me, and in some ways it was sparked by a conversation with my daughter-in-law, with Evan, who told me that Talia, my granddaughter, had been having nightmares. And they were blaming the nightmares on comic books that she's been reading with her dad, that she's fixated on, and they are pretty intense comic books. I mean, some as simple as The Wizard of Oz, but these are images that are not directly from the movies or even from Baum's original book. These are comic book images that are intense, and I don't know all the books she's reading, but Evan was definitely certain they were the cause of Talia's nightmares. And when she was telling me all this, I was feeling really guilty, because Talia and I had been downstairs in the basement playroom that we have in this house, and there's a whole stack of movie posters that come from the years I've been making movies, and they're just sitting in a stack, unpacked in a way. And Talia is really fascinated by them, and we were looking at them, and she wanted to know the story of all of each movie. And most of them are filled with the stuff of stories, which is conflict, drama, good guy, bad guy, scary stuff, joyful stuff. You know, the world that we live in is a world in which drama results from conflict, and conflict is at the core of storytelling. So I tried as best I could to tell her the stories of these movies, and realized as I did that each one of them is a lot for a child to hold on to. And I tried to make them child-friendly as best I could. But then Evan started telling me about the nightmares, which happened before this storytelling. But I did feel like, what stories can a child know? What stories can we tell them? And then I immediately remembered very dear friends of ours who had a daughter, and they determined never ever to tell her stories that had bad guys or bad things happen. Not to let her look at cartoons where there was a scary figure. Not to read her a fairy tale where there was a witch who put you in an oven and things of that nature, which the grim fairy tales are essentially there to terrorize young children, and also in some ways, I think, probably to make them aware of the world we're really in. But they felt if they could protect her from all of this, from all of the stories that surround children, they would create a much happier, much more wholesome, much more vibrant human being. And one day when she was about 5, this little girl came to me very confidentially, and she sat down with me and she said, I had a dream last night that I cut off my parents' heads and I ate out their eyeballs, and she started going into this unbelievably dark, demonic, terrifying journey, and she was kind of amazed by it and kind of enthralled by this thing she had done, and she wanted to tell me about it, and I'm going, I get it. I get it. It doesn't matter, in a sense, what stories we tell our children, they come bearing stories. These stories are within us. They are part of the zeitgeist. They are part of the psyche. They're part of what we are born with. We know the world when we come into the world. You step on an ant and you know something has happened there. You watch your father swat a fly. You don't have to make up a story. You don't have to read a book to know that something just transformed in a very big and remarkable way. And your curiosity, especially as a child, wants to explore all of that. Talia is amazed that she can touch an ant and has the power to extinguish its life. She doesn't, but she knows she has the power. And the world itself is instructing her in very real ways about its measure of light and dark. She is aware that there is both. When she was very, very young, she created a name for the creatures that she saw. She called them gunks. And it was a really interesting name, I thought. And she could describe them in great depth, with beaks and wings and all sorts of sort of archetypal imagery. And she was really, really caught by them and afraid of them, and also befriending of them, because it was very important for her to befriend her monsters. And she was very conscious of there are good monsters and not good monsters. And she loved to play where I or her dad or whoever would become a monster and chase her, or a monster in animal form like a black widow spider or something like that. She loved that. And then sometimes she would get really scared. She would get really scared. But whenever that happened, she would say, "You're not really a monster. You're not really, we're just playing." And I would say, "Of course, of course." But as I was telling her the stories of the movies that I wrote, I noticed something that happened to her. As soon as I started telling the story, she went, like that. Not unlike what you go through when you're meditating. She sat down and she left the world of Talia behind. She became one with the story. And let me explain something, because that's really important. Each of us, when we hear a story or read a story, experience a shift. And this shift is into something that is more or less universal. Yes, we bring our own experience to the story, but most stories take us out of ourself. And one of the things we love collectively about stories is that we journey outside of this structure and this mind and this set of imprints, and we become exposed to something bigger. And part of the enormous joy and importance of storytelling is our ability to leave us behind. For a short while, we actually are another person, another world, something that is completely engaged in an otherness, but most importantly, free of us. We touch a universal, especially in a good story, so that we have fear and hope and love and expectation and all of the things that happen in stories, but it's not about us. We are free to be part of something else, something bigger. And it is amazing to watch a child hear a story, because they are not there. They are in the story. They are outside of the limitations of their own physical boundaries. I had to pitch stories in Hollywood to make a career, meaning I had to go into a studio and sit with executives who all day long listened to stories. That's all they did. People came in and told them stories. And I could tell with most of these executives that the minutes I opened my mouth to talk, they were going, like they didn't want to hear another story. They were inured to the possibility of story. They've heard it all. It was like, yeah, okay, let's hear the story. And I understood very early on that there is a knack to storytelling. That there are stories that don't touch us, that don't provide this sense of otherness, that don't take us out of ourself. There are lots of stories that just pass the time. We just go, okay. Ha ha ha, I laughed a few times, I cried a few times, whatever. You're just going, okay. And that's kind of what they hear all day long, and they're trying to pick the best of those. But what they want is what Talia experienced the other day. What they want is to go, just like that. Every person who hears a story wants the same thing. Take me out of me and take me somewhere that amazes, that enthralls, that terrifies, that ennobles, that informs me of something outside of me. That's what everyone wants. And they wait for that moment. And when someone comes and delivers it, there's a thrill in it. And I knew after years of working this through in the pitch that I had to create something in that room of very jaded people that was akin to children in a kindergarten. And I knew when I had them, I could tell when I had them, because they would go from disinterest into, they were there. They were there. They were no longer in them. They were the place of universal being. And they knew when they were in universal being that they loved being there. And they loved that I took them there. And they wanted to hire me to write those movies, which was wonderful. It kept me employed for a very long time. And it's hard to do. It's hard to tell stories of that nature. But the great stories do it in a very big way. They take the world on a journey. The Harry Potter version of that, the Odyssey. The great dramas of the Greek dramatists and even the dramatists today. You walk into a theater for a play, and there's a curtain. And the curtain opens, and something in you goes, please take me. Please take me on a ride. And you wait for the first line, and you feel yourself seduced, if you're lucky, drawn in, and then 2 hours later, they put you back in your seat. And you go, you've cried, you've laughed, you've been entertained, it's been wonderful. And then they do this thing, they created movies. And movies created this thing where you go into a theater, and the experience is bigger than life. People are like giants. They're not like us. They're not our size. They're big. So you see them almost the way a child projects them. They're big. So you become not only part of the universal mind, but you become childlike in that mind. And you go, because you're really watching these vast images on a screen tell stories. And then they became Technicolor, and then they became CinemaScope, and they became Todd AO, and they became 70 millimeter and IMAX. And you're going, and 3D, so we're really, really not only watching movies, but there's no room for us. There's no room. We're overwhelmed by the magnitude of the story. Of course, what happens is mostly we're overwhelmed by spectacle. And the story often gets lost in the spectacle. And it doesn't really, what it does is it kind of shoves us out of ourselves, but it doesn't create the universal, it just creates an absence. It's like, okay, I'm absent, I am distracted from myself for a couple of hours. But the great stories can take all of that magnitude of sort of presentation and give you a story. And a story does that thing, which I said, takes you like, it's the most beautiful thing. It's what we hunger for, to be outside of us. Storytelling in living form is like a baseball game, or a hockey game, or a football game, where we have what I call one-pointedness, where masses of people all focus on one little tiny speck of a ball, all at the same time. Super Bowl, there are tens of millions of people watching this one thing. Will it get over the goal line? Will it not get over the goal line? Will somebody fumble it? Will somebody not fumble it? It's like great storytelling unfolding directly in front of you, and you're like engaged and also not there. You're part of a whole. You're part of something very, very large. And now, my son Josh, who does video games, presented me with an image. He was at a conference not long ago where they created a number of 3D immersive surround real, what's it called? Virtual reality games. And he put one of them on, it's called Ocular Rift, and Facebook just bought it for billions of dollars, but he said there was another one that by Sony that was even more amazing. And you put it on, and it's so convincing, it's so powerful, that you can barely stand. There's one of them where you walk over a ledge, and people who've fallen off this ledge actually start to crumble, and people have to catch them. And it's just watching an image. And they're creating another world for you to engage, another space altogether different from the one you're in right now. And it's completely engaging, and it has its own story. It's the future of storytelling, and all of the future of storytelling is, of course, full of the spectacle of it, but it all follows the same rules. And the rules are, take me out of my limited self and let me experience something greater. And now we have the ability to literally take you out of your world, out of your mind, out of the space that you're physically in, and to transplant it into a world that looks just like this one. So you get two realities. The reality of where you're observing from, and the reality of where you've just entered. And then you turn that off and you're back in this. Two different, fully realized realities, and it's only going to get better. Which of course starts to make you wonder, if you can create an alternate reality that is so completely and absolutely involving and convincing, how do we know that this reality isn't some incredible mechanism that we are all part of, that's projecting this wonderful, wonderful story, and that every so often we get to step back from the engagement of that story and just be the observer. We are just the observer, and we begin to understand that that may be all we are, is this extraordinary observer of a reality. The thing that's so incredible about being the observer is it frees you from the story at the same time as it allows you to enter that story. But what happens when you have a spiritual life and you begin to meditate, means get quiet, and you sit still, and you start to disengage from all of the story elements of your life, meaning the drama. Will I get the job? Will I not get the job? Will I find the perfect mate? Will I not find the perfect mate? Am I going to die in a horrible fire, or am I going to die in the ocean, or whatever, all this drama that keeps us going all the time. Suddenly you sit down and you go, oh, it feels so wonderful. You are out of yourself, but not in a story. You're out of yourself and just a still point. It's the same feeling as being in a story, only there's no story. There's just, it feels as released, as open and free and expansive and joyous as when you become one with something else. Only this time, there's nothing to engage you except the experience of observation, or to rest in the very space that perceives the universe. That is what meditation is. It frees you. Reading a story imitates that experience. Reading a story, hearing of something that takes you out of yourself is very similar to the meditative experience. It's very similar to the awakened experience. You are free to be another world, to be that entire world and not essentially be of it. You are running through it, experiencing it, touching it, and knowing at the same time you're the observer. Spiritually, when you go deep into yourself and you sit still, the drama of your life arises, thoughts arise, distractions arise, and you feel from this very extraordinarily still pointed place, not caught by it. You can actually watch it arise. You can watch thoughts as they begin to emerge and flower and grab your attention. But you have the freedom in deep meditation to go, aha. You see it, but you don't enter it. You watch it, but you're not caught by it. It's kind of what my mother used to say to me when I was a young boy watching movies and completely given over to the story. And I was so frightened or disturbed, and she would go, "It's only a movie. It's only a movie." And that would really free me up. I go, "Oh, thank you. It's only a movie." And in a way, a meditation teacher is trying to tell you the same thing. It's only a life. It's only a life. It's another story that you are telling yourself. And that's really important, because life is happening. It's unfolding just moment to moment to moment to moment. And there you are telling yourself a story about it. In other words, something happens and you go, "Oh, I don't like that. This is scary. This is good. That's bad. That was terrible," because past tense starts to emerge. And you go, "I didn't like that then, and I'm not going to go there this time. And I like this because this really imprints me and impacts me in a particular way that I like. This imprints something awful, so I want to avoid that." And then you start to weave together the story that you are, and that you become totally caught in your story, in the way that you're caught in the story when you hear another story. Although when you're giving yourself over to another story, it's freeing you from your story. But when you're in your story, how do you get free of that? Because your story starts to become much more compelling and much more continual and much less satisfying sometimes than the stories you can be freed to enter. So there you are, caught in a story you can't get out of. That's a real trap. That's a real problem. And that's why meditation brings you to this place. You find an ability to sit still and see it all as your own projection. Clearly something is going on. Things are happening. Things you can label good and things you can label bad. Things that don't function well together, that create conflict and drama. That all does start to happen. But they are all, in a certain sense, affected by how you relate to them. And how you relate to them really is, in a sense, you weaving all of this together to become story. You project this bad thing happened and that bad thing happened, and oh my God, something terrible is going to happen. I mean, you know, when you walk down a dark street at night past a dark alley, that something terrible can reside there. Something in you knows that. Why? Because possibly when you were a child, you started walking down a dark alley and your mind went, what's down that alley? Maybe a little dog barked at you or a little mouse ran by or who knows what. But your experience of dark alleys often tells you something is going to emerge that's going to be scary. What I find really interesting is the little girl who saw eating her mother's head, cutting off her mother's head. Where did that come from? Where did that come from? And that's the key thing, because we are imprinted with story. We are imprinted with this need to fill the darkness. Children in the dark of night want the light on, often. Why do they want the light on? Because their own mind already is filling the darkness with images. And they're already filling it with images that are fearsome to them. And those images don't come from the stories they are hearing. They don't come from stories they've never heard. They arise out of their own archetypal need to emerge. They are part of the human psyche. And so we are born with stories coming at us and stories that we are forming. We are creatures who are completely consumed by the story experience. And all we really want is to have somebody say to us, it's only a movie. You're going to be okay. It's not a problem. You run into your mother's and father's room and say, I had a nightmare, and they hug you and they wash away that darkness. They free you of the fear. And then as you get older, you have to find ways to free yourself of the fear. And so you tell yourself another story, which is, that's only a story. That's not really going to happen. You tell yourself these things aren't going to happen. You tell yourself it's not real. And you find a way to build into the system something that, as a story, that counteracts stories. But freedom, liberation, truth, if you will, is that there is an observer observing all of this. There is something watching. There is a universal mind, if you will, that loves stories, that creates stories, that involves you in stories, but also ultimately is free of those stories. And you discover that universal mind by sitting still and letting go and just being. And then you find this place of the observer. You discover who's watching. Who is watching? Who is so engaged? Who lives for these stories? And it's you. You. You are watching. But when I say you, I don't mean ego-minded you. I don't mean the story that you told yourself you are that's watching. There's something that's watching that, and that's who you are. There is the observer, and the observer is one-pointed, absolute, real, and true. We sit in meditation to find that. The awakening experience is that there's no you at all. There's just this. There's just this. The arising of endless, infinite materialization, matter. It is always coming into being second by second by second, and the mind weaves it together, and ultimately the mind unweaves it. This does not stop. It is infinite and eternal. The observation of it is also infinite and eternal, and that's who you are. You are the observer of the arising of matter. And in some ways, you are the matter that arises. You are all that is. You are the infinite storyteller and the infinite audience. And you are engaged and disengaged simultaneously. And you are as caught as you want to be. But at some point, it's important to know it's only a story. Any questions?